Welcome to another segment of Provocative Conversations, destined to provoke further thought and spark greater questions regarding God, church, and the religious establishments of both the past and the present. I am the proud heretic, Mr. Provocateur himself. Continuing on with part 2 of Your Perception of God Means Everything. Again, literally, your perception, how you conceive God, how you perceive God, your theoretical view of God, your hypotheses of God, your formation of God within your concept of Him means absolutely everything. It again affects how you see things, how you see God, how you see you, how you see people, how you see situations and circumstances, how you view inwardly, how you view things outwardly, how much of it you dismiss within your life or within the life of others or the lives of others in regards to the things that occur in their life that do not seem to line up with your perception of God, your concept of God, your theory, your theoretical views of God, your hypotheses of God. It all matters. It's all relevant. It's all relative to, in relation with your perception of God. Now, I made mention of a couple of things on part 1 that I never did completely either clarify or go into detail regarding. I want to make mention of those things. One of the things that I dealt with was the subject or the story of David and Shimei. Maybe my pronunciation of Shimei, it could very well be wrong. It could be Shimei. I just call it Shimei. Don't get lost on the small things as it relates to God and the things of God when it comes to scripture or when it comes to principle. Well, I'm not going to say principle because principle, even in a small detail, is important. But when it comes to the little issues, there's a verse in the Bible that says it's the little foxes that brings forth the destruction. I don't want things to be lost because of the little foxes, such as me not pronouncing a particular word right or me getting a particular part of a storyline wrong in the Bible. The storyline is not as important as the principle of the matter, the principle detail, the details that speak forth the principle. It's mainly the principle that counts. Again, that's why Jesus said, search the scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life. The scriptures themselves speak forth truth in their essence when the scripture that you are holding is based upon, founded in principle. And that's something that I'll deal with at another time. Okay, one of the things that I spoke of in part 1 was regarding David and Shimei. And I never really got into detail about David and Shimei because I got sidetracked on a particular part when I mentioned something regarding Jesus. And so David and Shimei is something that I want to start with in this segment of Your Perception of God. And it's found in 2 Samuel. So it's 2 Samuel chapter 16. 2 Samuel is in a time period during the reign, or this was actually at the end of Saul's reign, and David, I think 40 years prior, had been ordained as the leader, the successor to Saul. And so here we have it where David is leading, just beginning his leadership role. Not that he wasn't already playing a leadership role in a couple of ways, but officially leader. And Saul had recently died. And Saul had a cousin, and that cousin's name was Shimei, or Shammai, or whatever you want to call him. And here's David, and here's Shimei. 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 5 says like this. It says a header. I'm in the New Living Translation, which is a translation I pretty much like because it's simplistic and it gets to the point without all the shenanigans or whatever, and it doesn't give spooky Christians, spooky leaders space and place to play and add to things and dramatize things and make you, twivel in your toes and tinkle in your hands and all of that other stuff. So here we go. Verse 5, it says, as King David came to Baharum, a man came out of the village cursing them. So here's David coming into a town, and then another man coming out of the village was cursing at him and his men. And it was Shimei, son of Gera, from the same clan as Saul's family. He threw stones at the king and the king's officers and all the mighty warriors who surrounded him. Get out of here, you murderer, because, they felt that David had Saul murdered and he had some play in all of that. But if you remember the story, David was just as crushed of Saul's death, just as if David was Saul's son, because David understood that was someone that God had chosen. So he threw stones at the king and the king's officers and all the mighty warriors who surrounded him. And he said, get out of here, you murderer, you scoundrel. He shouted at David, and he said, the Lord is paying you back for all the blood shed in Saul's clan. You stole his throne, and now the Lord has given it to your son Absalom, because Absalom had undermined his father, and this guy was stating that, God is doing to you what you did to Saul. And at last you will taste some of your own medicine, for you are a murderer. Right there, it lets you know, however you perceive God, it means everything as to how you perceive situations and circumstances, how you view what someone else is going through. Because if your perception of God is wrong, then you will see what's happening in someone else's life. You will tie that, or you will draw a nexus between that and something else, depending on your perception of God, how you perceive God. If you perceive that God is hating on somebody, you perceive that God is hating on a particular sin, when a person commits that sin, in your head, God is repaying that person. Just like Shimei stated here, that, God is repaying you. He's bringing back on your head what you brought onto Saul's head, not realizing that David had nothing to do with Saul's death. David was all about preserving Saul, and if you remember the story, David had multiple times where he could have killed Saul, and he said, "There be it that I would touch God's anointed, the one that God has chosen to lead." He could have had his head, and he didn't choose to. And Saul's son and David were very close, which is why David took it so very hard when Saul was eventually killed. But what I'm trying to say there is Shimei's perception of God was not based upon a true concept, not based upon the true precepts of God, wasn't based upon the principle of God's heart, which is the principle of love. So Shimei saw that God is doing to you through your son Absalom what you did to Saul. It has returned unto your head. And that's how so many people have done me over the years. They felt that, the reason you're going through what you're going through is because God is. And even if God is, your perception is still wrong as to why God is. Because God is always working a thing, but whatever God is working, he's never punishing you in the sense of retaliation, in the sense of retribution, in the sense of sowing and reaping, to the degree that it becomes a punishment in a negative sense. It works against his will, his purpose, his plan for you. It works against his person, his character, his nature. Whatever God does, it has to be done in consistency with who he is, with what he is, with his nature, with his character, with his, in his, through his love, in all of it. Love will never go forth without mercy. Mercy or judgment will never go forth without mercy. The Bible says, I'll have mercy instead of judgment. The Bible doesn't establish the fact that his judgment endures forever. But it does establish in the book of Psalms throughout, especially in one of the chapters of Psalms, one of the higher chapters of Psalms, it shows where almost every verse at the end say, or the verse after the verse, or the statement after one statement, it keeps saying over and over and over and over, but his mercy endures forever. His mercy endures forever. So when you have a perception of God, that his character is one of judgment, that God believes in total suffrage and he doesn't leave space for his mercy, or you don't leave space for his mercy, because what you are and what you believe and what your concept is, what your perception of God is, does not change who God is and what he is and what he does and how he does what he does, when he does what he does, to who he does what he does to. So even though it doesn't change God, it definitely changes your perception, or your perception changes you. Your perception of God actually changes how you deal with people, how you deal with situations and circumstances. And a lot of people have sat on the sidelines and judged me based upon their twisted perception of God. Because however you perceive God, that's how you will handle people. So anyway, in chapter 16, verse 9, it says, why should this dog curse my Lord, the king? Abishai, whatever his name is, son of Zeruiah, demanded, let me go over and cut his head. So one of David's strong men said, hey, look, why should we stand here and let this man curse you out like that, David? We can't do that. This guy reminds me of the New Testament, where Peter was like, when the soldiers came out to, was it the centurion soldiers or whatever, but they came out to arrest Jesus, or the Roman soldiers or whatever. But anyway, they came out to arrest Jesus. And as they were arresting Jesus, or about to arrest Jesus, they took charge, over the situation. And Peter took charge over the situation and was like, no. Basically, you're not going to do this. It didn't state it like this, but it was basically how it played out. I'm not going to let you do this. I'm not going to stand by here and let you take my Lord, my Savior. I'm not going to let you do that, even though I don't think Peter fully understood exactly who Jesus was, even though it was stated earlier that Jesus asked, who do you say that I am? And Peter said, well, some say you're this. Well, people said, some say you're this, some say you're that. And then he said, but who do you say that I am? And Jesus said, you're the Son of the living God for the most part. That's what he said. And Jesus said, look, man, wow, flesh and blood didn't reveal that to you, Peter. That came from on high. That's a revelation there. So even though Peter stated a revelation, it doesn't necessarily mean that he actually fully understood what he revealed, because again, later on, he ended up denying Jesus 3 times. So if he really understood that he was the Son of God, which meant he would understand how much power the Son of God actually has, he wouldn't have been afraid to pronounce openly that, hey, I am a part of his crew. I am one of his boys. I did follow him throughout his earthly ministry, but instead Peter denied him 3 times. So that shows that perhaps Peter didn't have a full understanding, a full concept of who he was, but he had enough concept of who he was, and I guess enough love or enough commitment to him, to Jesus, that he was willing to do what this Abishai was willing to do, which is, let me go take this man out. And Peter Peter pulled his sword out, and he was going to take his head off. I'll tell you, I don't know if Peter was going to take his head off, but it states that he took his ear off. He cut his ear. But Jesus, in return, healed that guy's ear. And he said, look, you all cut this out. You don't realize this has to be. This is how this must be. Understand the God that you worship. Jesus said earlier to his disciples, he said, you all don't know what manner of spirit you're of, because you all are willing to go out and hurt people. He said, I'm not coming here to hurt. I'm not coming here to kill people. I'm coming here in the person of God. I'm coming here representing the person of God. I'm coming here to show the world who God truly is, because he said, when you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So Jesus was correcting Peter. He was correcting his disciples in the other situation regarding their perception of God. He was basically saying, you're going to have to get your perception of God right. Your concept of God is lacking. And understandable back then. Because, you're talking thousands of years ago now. Those guys didn't know what we know. They didn't have what we have. They didn't have the knowledge that we possess. Revelation hadn't been unfolded the way that it has been or is being now. So they didn't have the tools or anything to work with the way that we do. So they truly didn't understand what we understand now. But their concept, even in what they were able to understand, was still misguided, misled, and their perception failed them, or their perception of God was not proper. And Jesus corrected their perception by correcting that man's ear. And here you have David, one of his fighting men, basically did the same thing. He said, look, let me go over and cut off his ear in verse 9. And then David responded just like Jesus did. He said, no, the king said, who asked your opinion, you sons of Zeruiah? Well, however, if the Lord has told this man to curse me, who are you to stop him? If the Lord has told this man to curse me, who are you to stop him? Do you understand what that means? That means that it's almost like we talked about Balaam and Balak. And let me get it correct this time, like in the first part, in part 1 of your perception of God, I spoke about Balaam and Balak, and I said because both of their names have that B-A-L, I kind of get it mixed up. Okay, well, for the record, Balaam is B-A-L-A-A-M. He is the prophet of God, okay? And then you have Balak. He's the king of Moab. He's the king of the Moabites, okay? So here you have the king of the Moabites asking the king or the prophet of God to go curse people. Go curse these people that are a threat to him, not so much because of what they do, but because of the God they serve and the way that their God fights for them and shows up on their behalf. And so he was saying, go curse them so that we won't have to worry about them coming through our land and destroying us and all, which was a work in futility alone in itself. But anyway, David stated, he said, you sons of Zeruiah, if the Lord has told him to curse me, who are you to stop me? David apparently had a different concept of God. He had a different perception of God as it relates to God in that matter, at the least. His perception was different. And because his perception was different, his reaction to the situation, to the circumstances surrounding the situation, to the individual involved in the situation, wrong he may have been. But because David's perception was right, David was able to see through what this guy was saying. He was able to see through what this guy was willing to do, wanting to do, and how this guy was throwing rocks at him and how he was basically spitting at him and using foul language, curses. Now, we don't know what he used. They definitely didn't talk English back then. English wasn't even an established language back then. So what did he use? Better yet, what is a curse word? That's a question. What is a curse word? That's a good question. Since there are no lists of curses, what is a curse word? What actually is a curse word? Who defines what a curse word is? Truly. But anyway, David, because he had a different perspective, He had a different perception. He perceived God, especially in that matter, in a whole different light, in a whole different manner. He was able to respond in a whole different manner than what his predecessors or his counterparts were ready to do. They were ready to hurt this man. And David's saying, look, leave him alone. What if God chose for this man to curse us? What if it is God's will and purpose and plan for us to be cursed by this man, for us to be tried by this man? What if God was in Joseph's brothers selling him into Egypt? What if God was in Judas denying or selling Jesus out? What if God was in Peter denying Jesus 3 times? What if God was in those soldiers arresting Jesus? What if God was in the situation with Pilate, Jesus going before Pilate and Pilate saying, don't you know that I have the power to release you or to have you put in jail? What if, especially when Jesus' response was, well, Mr. Pilate, you actually have no power at all except that which was given to you. What if it is true that I cannot stop who God has sent to curse? What if it's true that I cannot curse who God has not cursed? Nor can I bless who God has not blessed. That brings in questions regarding prayer. That brings in definite questions regarding this so-called human will factor. This factoring in of this powerful and potent human will. We'll see about that one as well at a later time. I may pinch off of it a little bit, but right now, that's as far as I'll go with it. So, you see David saying what he said. What if God used this man? Verse 11, David said to Abishai and to all his servants, my own son is trying to kill me, Absalom. Okay? He said, doesn't this relative of Saul have even more reason to do so? David was finding fair ground. He was finding just cause for this guy, Shimei, to be cursing him. David said, look, I can understand why this guy is doing this here. I can see why he's doing this here. Why? Because he had a different perspective of things. His perception of God was different. When your perception is different, your response is different. Your outlook is different. Your inward look at things is different. How you see people, how you view people, how you react to people is different. It's not all just black and white the way that religious-minded people want it to be. If it's all black and white, why do we have such utter disdainful political turmoil going on right now in our day and age in politics? If it's all just black and white, why don't we call a spade a spade? Why don't we just call leprosy leprosy? Because even within us, it's not all black and white. Then again, in a whole nother sense, it is about black and white. Because so much in our culture, so much in our societies has to deal with black and white, race, color, segregation, classism. This is serious. Your perception of God means absolutely everything. So, David goes on to say, since my son himself is trying to kill me, I can understand why one of Saul's relatives feels the need to do the same. So leave him alone and let him curse Jesus said, Peter, leave him alone. Let him do his job. For this cause did I come. I came for this man to do what he's doing. Get off the man's tip and let the man do what he's doing. This is what this man was called and ordained, predetermined by God himself to do. Peter, remember, I was slain before the foundations of the earth. Don't get mad at Adam and sure not Eve. It is what it is. And since we like to put Steve in the story of Adam and Eve, don't you get mad at Steve or Stephanie. Well, I tell you, that's real. We'll get on that at another time as well. So, he said, leave him alone. Let him curse. For the Lord has told him to do it. And perhaps the Lord will see that I am being wronged and will bless me because of these curses today. So David and his men continued down the road, and Shimei kept pace with them on the opposite side or on a nearby hillside, still walking right along beside him, cursing and throwing stones and dirt at David. I don't care how many stones they throw and how much dirt they kick up. As long as your perception of God is proper, it means everything, and it will determine everything that you do, that you think, that you ponder. It determines how much you accept, how much you're willing to suffer, how much you're willing to endure. It means absolutely everything. So David and his men continued down the road, and Shimei kept pace with them on a nearby hillside, cursing and throwing stones and dirt at David. And then it says in verse 14, the king and all who were with him, they grew weary along the way. So they rested when they reached Jordan. I'm sure Shimei tired them out. But because David's perception was right, he was able to get his men's perception right. And undoubtedly, their perception was made right by David, but ultimately God. God used David's perception of him and how David perceived God. God used that to widen their view, widen their perception of the situation at hand. One of the root word out of perception is perceive. 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 To perceive something is to notice it, to notice something, especially something that escapes the notice of others. I think that's where a lot of us mess up at. We're not noticing the noticeable things of God. We have eyes, but we're not seeing. We have ears, but we're not hearing. We're so caught up and blindsided by religion and tradition and what mama and them and grandma and them and all them other nims have been doing forever and ever that we fail to take notice of what is right there in front of us. And then it says, especially something that escapes the notice of others. If you want the mere fact of perceiving God in its naked definition has the meaning that it's something that you see, that you've noticed, that others have not taken notice of. Something that you see that has escaped the notice or the attention of others. It's not that they didn't have the opportunity to see it or whatever, per the definition that is, but that it has just escaped their ability to see. I do believe that God can have two people experience the same thing and both of them see something totally different. All because of perception. All because of how they perceive the thing, how they perceive what they perceive. when they perceive, if they perceive anything. To perceive is to understand or interpret something in a particular way. How do you come to understand God? How do you interpret God? Why do you understand him in that way? Why do you interpret him in that way? What formed your understanding of that? What is your understanding of that mixed with? Where does your interpretation of that comes from? To understand or think about something in a particular way. To notice or realize something, mainly something different. Another word that comes out of perceive is perceptibility. 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 It's something that's detectable. How do you detect God? What is your method by which you detect God in a thing? In the hearing of a thing, in the seeing of a thing, in the experience of a thing. How do you detect him? Perceptibility is something that is large enough, great enough, or distinct enough to be noticed. Is your knowledge of God, is your experience with God large enough? Is it great enough to even perceive him? To even detect him? To notice him? Or is your life so muddied up with confusion, your mouth, you always going out and doing other things, being with other people, always on the phone, always on the internet, that you never even have enough time to actually learn God himself? That you never come into a knowledge of God? You never come into a detectable state of perceiving him? You have no experience that's large enough or great enough or distinct enough to even notice God? Even though I do know, and I'll speak of this at some other time in depth, but how large your experience is, how great your experience is, how distinct your experiences are, is predetermined by God. But it's a shame that when you have a small set of knowledge and a small set of experience, and you have knowledge and experience that has no distinction whatsoever outside of tradition and church and what someone else has stated or said, and then you argue with someone who has been given, ordained the level of experience, the size of the experience, the greatness of it, the impact of the experience, the distinction of the experience. And you want to argue with that person and tell that person how wrong they are and how wrong their perception is. Perceptibility is something that is able to be seen or heard. Do you perceive God in the things that you experience? Do you perceive God at home in your situations, on your bed, in your vehicle? Do you perceive him in those nasty things? Do you perceive God in those people that you condemn to hell? Do you perceive God in homosexuals? Do you perceive God in lesbians? Do you perceive God in so-called molesters of any sort, or manipulators. Because the reason I say in any sort, because you have all types of sorts. Of course, you have sexual. Of course, you have political. You have financial. You have educational extortioners. You have all types of extortioners of probably mostly every walk. So how do you view them? How do you see God in them, in regards to them? Do you look, do you listen carefully to detect God? Not his judgment, not his hellfire, not his eternal damnation, but do you seek to perceive him? Him. God. Because your perception of God means everything. The definition itself of perception is the process of using the senses to acquire information about the surrounding environment or situation. Now that's frightening in itself, to base your perception upon your five senses. If you're really going to come into a distinct knowledge of God and a distinct experience with God, you're going to have to cut out your five senses. What you see physically, hear physically, touch physically, taste physically, smell, okay? See, hear, touch, taste, smell. Those five senses, if you don't rid yourself or cut yourself away from those things, you will never see God the way that you ought to see him. You will miss him. You will not detect him. Why? Because God, though he does use your senses at times, there is a depth and there is an experience, a greater degree of experiences that require no senses, neither of your five senses. In fact, you're forbidden to use those senses. Why? Because God is trying to get you to walk by your belief structure, by your inner man, by your inner self, by that part of you that no man can touch, that no man established, that part of you that has nothing to do with your subconscious or your conscious state so much as it does your spirit state. Whatever that spirit state curtails, that spirit state, I use it in the sense of that state of existence, that state of that base of knowledge, that base of intuition that you don't impart into. It's just imparted into you. You partake of, but you don't impart it because it has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with God, or the God factor, the God concept. It's an attitude or an understanding based upon what is observed or thought. Is how you think of God based upon your own observation, physical observation, your own thoughts that were fed to you, or your thoughts that were fed to you by people, by religion, by Christianity, by whatever else you may have, come into contact with throughout the course of your life? Is that where your perception of God comes from? It's important to know where it comes from because, again, your perception of God means everything. Everything is hinged upon your perception. It is important to have your perception correct. It is important to make sure that how you see God and how you view God is you have correct sight of God. You see him clearly. You know, they say, I can see clearly now. The rain is gone. I can see clearly now that the misconception is gone, that my concepts of God are right, that my perception of God is right, that my overview and my foresight and my insight and my afterthoughts are right. All of this is important, but it's all based upon your perception. It is necessary to get your perception right. It's all about your perception. Let's continue to talk about that.